I've always loved the quiet. That's the real reason I camp alone and hike alone. It's not about proving anything to anyone. It's about the silence. The kind of silence that presses against you like a weight, smoothing out the chaos of everyday life. Out here, far from deadlines and the blaring traffic, I can hear my own thoughts. But it's a fragile thing, the peace that the wilderness offers. I've learned that the quiet can also play tricks on you, turn on you. That's what happened to me in the San Juan National Forest. I'd been camping alone plenty of times before, but this trip was different. I still have trouble putting it into words. All I know is that the silence stopped being my friend somewhere on the second day. I'd planned to be out there for 4 days, just long enough to clear my head and reset. The spot I'd picked was remote, a stretch of dense forest near Pagosa Springs that even the locals didn't visit often. It was perfect, or so I thought. The first day went like it always does. The drive up was uneventful, and after a few hours of hiking, I found the perfect campsite. It was tucked away by a creek, surrounded by towering pines, with a small clearing just big enough for my tent and fire pit. I felt that familiar rush of excitement as I set up camp, the freedom of being out here completely alone, with nothing but wilderness around me. That first night was easy. I sat by the fire, listening to the water rush over the rocks in the creek. I wrote in my journal a bit, mostly just notes about the hike and some thoughts about work. Then I crawled into my tent, ready to sleep. The silence was comforting at first, as it always is, but I woke up in the middle of the night to something strange. It was subtle, just a faint whispering sound, like the wind picking up through the trees. I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing, and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next day, things started to go wrong. I woke up later than I'd planned, the sky already a pale blue overhead. My stove was acting up, which was weird because it had worked fine the night before. It just wouldn't light, no matter what I tried. I ended up eating cold granola and packing up my camp, ready to move deeper into the forest. That's when I noticed my GPS wasn't working. I'd had reception when I camped here before, but now my phone was useless, no signal at all. I wasn't worried yet, though. I'd brought a map, and I knew the area well enough to navigate without technology. Still, the feeling that something wasn't right settled in, and I couldn't shake it. The hike was harder than I expected. My legs felt heavier, like the air itself was weighing me down, and the forest was quiet, too quiet. Normally you'd hear birds or the occasional rustle of squirrels in the underbrush, but today it was just still. The silence felt unnatural. I found another campsite by late afternoon, a little further into the woods next to a meadow that looked untouched. I set up my tent quickly, eager to get a fire going, but as I worked, the feeling of being watched crept up on me. I couldn't shake it. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, nothing was there, just trees and shadows, but the sensation wouldn't leave. That night, I heard the whispers again. This time, they were louder, clearer, and they weren't random. They were saying something, my name. I sat up in my tent, my heart pounding. The sound was faint but unmistakable, drifting on the breeze from somewhere just beyond the clearing. I grabbed my flashlight, thus unzipped the tent and shone the light into the trees. Nothing. The forest was still, the fire flickering in the corner of my vision. I stood there for a long time listening, but the whispering had stopped. It was just the wind. It had to be. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the third day, I was exhausted. I hadn't slept much the night before, and the feeling of unease had only grown stronger. My gear wasn't cooperating either. When I tried to pack up my tent, I found that the poles had bent. They were new, barely used, but somehow they were warped like something had twisted them while I slept. It didn't make sense. The whispering was back too, even during the day. It followed me as I hiked, a faint sound on the edge of hearing, like someone walking just out of sight. I kept telling myself it was the wind, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I wasn't alone out here. Then there was the whistling. It started around midday, just after I'd set up my third camp. At first I thought it was a bird, but the sound was too deliberate, too human. It came from somewhere deep in the woods, a high, clear note that echoed through the trees. I froze, listening. The sound grew louder, closer, then stopped as suddenly as it had begun. I called out, hoping it was another hiker, someone who stumbled across my camp, but there was no response, just silence. I tried to stay calm, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. Now, it felt like something was circling me, just beyond my vision, waiting. That night, the whispers didn't stop. I lay in my tent, wide awake, listening as the sound of my name drifted through the trees. It was faint at first, like it had been the night before, but as the hours passed, it grew louder, more insistent. Dylan. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. The fire had died down, casting long, flickering shadows across the clearing. I scanned the trees, heart racing, but there was nothing, just darkness. I was about to crawl back into my tent when I saw something move, a shadow slipping between the trees. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was too big to be an animal, and it was moving too deliberately, like it was watching me, waiting. I turned off my flashlight and backed into the tent, my mind racing. I'd never been this scared in the woods before, not once in all the years I'd camped alone. But now, there was something out there. I could feel it. I zipped the tent shut and tried to calm my breathing, but the whispers were inside my head now. They weren't just outside, they were all around me. Dylan, Dylan. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in my tent, clutching the flashlight, listening as the whispers circled me. Sometimes it sounded like one voice, sometimes several, but it was always the same soft, insistent calling my name. By dawn, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get out of these woods. But as I started hiking, the whistling began again. This time it was closer, following me like something was walking just behind me, whistling a slow, eerie tune. I didn't stop to look. I didn't want to see whatever it was. I just kept walking, faster and faster, until I was practically running down the trail. But then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I froze, heart pounding in my chest, and slowly turned around. There, standing just at the edge of the clearing, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were hollow, and its lips were curled into a grin. It stood there, staring at me, its head cocked to the side as if amused. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The whistling had stopped, and now there was only silence, a silence so thick it pressed down on me like a weight. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, waiting. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but eventually I turned and ran. I ran until my legs burned and my lungs felt like they were going to burst. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead where my car was parked. When I finally looked back, the figure was gone. I never told anyone what happened in the San Juan National Forest. Not really. I tried to explain it to myself 1,000 different ways. Exhaustion, anxiety, maybe even altitude sickness. But none of that explains the whispers or the whistling or the figure that watched me from the trees. I haven't been camping since. The fog was thicker than I'd expected. I pulled my RV into a secluded clearing in Pisgah National Forest and stepped out into the damp air, the smell of wet earth heavy in my nose. Everything was muffled, as though the forest was holding its breath. The trees were shrouded in mist, their trunks fading into the gloom, and the trail I had heard so much about was hidden somewhere out there, waiting for me. I'd come here to find something unique. My vlog had been stagnating, and I needed a fresh angle. A fellow hiker had mentioned an unmarked trail, a path that didn't appear on any maps, one that locals said disappeared and reappeared as though it had a life of its own. Perfect. If I could document it and film the mystery, my audience would eat it up. I grabbed my camera and set it up, filming a quick introduction. Hey everyone, it's Nate here, and I'm in the middle of the misty Pisgah National Forest, about to track down the infamous Vanishing Trail. Legend says this path comes and goes, and people who wander too far down it don't come back. Let's see if that's true. I packed up my gear and set off into the fog. The forest was silent, the only sound my boots crunching on the damp leaves. I had a GPS in my pocket, just in case, but I didn't plan to use it unless things got really bad. I wanted to go off the grid, find this mysterious trail, and see if there was anything to the rumors. I'd always been a skeptic. Ghost stories and folklore were fun to tell around a campfire, but not much else. As I walked, the fog thickened, swallowing the trees. It clung to my skin, cold and heavy. It wasn't long before I found the first strange marker, a stone slab jutting from the ground, its surface covered in symbols, strange spiraling shapes that didn't look like any language I knew. I filmed it, talking into the camera as I described the find. This looks like something from an old burial ground, but there's no mention of this on any maps. Really makes you wonder what else is out here, hidden beneath the fog. I kept moving, the trees closing in tighter. The trail I was following became fainter, more overgrown, and soon it was little more than a game trail, barely wide enough to follow. I pushed forward, keeping my camera rolling, but after another hour of hiking, the trail simply disappeared. One moment there had been a clear path, and now it was gone, swallowed by the forest. The mist curled around the trees, thick and almost suffocating, but I was certain I'd been on the right trail. I checked my GPS, but the signal flickered weakly. The screen showed that I was in the middle of nowhere. No path, no landmarks, just a blank screen with a blinking dot. Me, standing alone in the fog. "Okay," I muttered. "You've dealt with worse." I turned back the way I'd come, but the forest looked different now. The trees seemed closer together, the undergrowth denser. The fog was disorienting, and I had to rely on instinct to retrace my steps. The GPS was useless. I kept walking, scanning the ground for signs of the trail, but there was nothing. I was starting to feel uneasy. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, not mine. I froze, listening. The sound came from deeper in the forest, slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on the leaves. I turned, scanning the fog, but there was nothing, just the swirling mist. Then, out of the gloom, a figure emerged. An older man, his clothes tattered and damp, his eyes wide and vacant. "Hey," I called, my voice echoing through the stillness. "You lost too?" The man looked at me for a moment, then shuffled forward. He seemed off. His clothes were torn, his face pale, and there was a distant look in his eyes, like he wasn't entirely there. "I've been walking for days," he said, his voice hoarse. "The trail, it keeps changing." "Are you okay?" I asked, stepping toward him. He shook his head. "No one's okay out here." I frowned, feeling a cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. "What do you mean?" "The trail, it moves. I've seen it, watched it disappear and reappear. It's not just a path, it's the forest. It doesn't want us to leave." I stared at him, my mind racing. This guy was either delirious or onto something. Either way, I didn't like the way he was talking. "Look," I said, pulling out my GPS. "We can find our way back." The man glanced at the GPS, then back at me. "It won't help. The forest is messing with it." I didn't believe him. I couldn't. I was a rational guy, and this was just a forest. I'd get us back to my RV, get him some help, and be done with it. But as we walked, things got stranger. The mist thickened, wrapping around the trees like a living thing. The forest seemed to shift with every step. What had been an open path a moment ago was now choked with brambles. When I looked back, the trees seemed to loom closer, twisting into unfamiliar shapes. The man, whose name I learned was Eli, grew more agitated with every passing minute. "It's watching us," he muttered. "It knows we're here." "Who's watching?" I asked, growing impatient. "The forest," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's alive, and it's been here long before we were." I ignored him, focusing on the GPS, but even that was failing me. The screen flickered, the signal cutting in and out. At one point, it showed me standing on a clear path, but when I looked up, there was nothing but trees. Thick, twisted trees that looked like they had grown there for centuries. We kept walking, the fog growing thicker, pressing in on us. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and then the whispers started. Faint at first, like the wind through the leaves, but then more distinct voices calling out from the mist. "Nate?" I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Eli nodded, his eyes wide. "It's calling us, the forest." I tried to shake it off, tell myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The voice had spoken my name. We came across a backpack tangled in the branches of a tree high above our heads. It was old, covered in dirt and torn, but when I climbed up to retrieve it, I found fresh supplies inside, water, food, like someone had packed it yesterday. I felt a chill run down my spine. How had it gotten there? Eli was growing more paranoid, his eyes darting around as though he expected the trees to come alive at any moment. "We need to leave," he kept saying, "before it's too late." We pushed forward, But no matter which direction we went, we ended up back where we started. The fog seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, the whispers growing louder. Then, without warning, Eli was gone. I turned around and he was just gone. The forest had swallowed him whole without a sound. I called out his name, but there was no response, only the dense mist pressing in on me. Panic set in. I was alone, lost in a forest that didn't want me to leave. The GPS was useless, and my camera was flickering, showing distorted footage of things I hadn't seen, shadows moving in the trees, figures lurking just out of sight. I started running, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The trees twisted and shifted around me, the fog so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Every time I thought I'd found a way out, the forest closed in, trapping me in a maze of branches and brambles. The whispers were louder now, calling my name over and over. My camera caught glimpses of movement, dark figures moving through the mist, vanishing before I could focus on them. I didn't know what was real anymore. The forest seemed to warp around me, bending reality to its will. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fog broke. I stumbled out of the trees and found myself back at my RV. The mist lingered at the edge of the forest, but it didn't follow. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys, threw my gear into the RV, and drove off, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the forest a distant memory in the rearview mirror. I wasn't supposed to be here. Not really. Not in this forest. Not sitting in this RV, staring at the tall trees outside, wondering if this trip would be my last. Fort Pino National Forest had been Karen's idea years ago. She had this way of looking at the world, seeing the beauty in everything. She wanted to camp here, hike the trails, soak in the stillness of the ancient trees. I didn't get it then, too caught up in work, too busy to care. But now it was all I had left. It had been a year since she died, and I still couldn't make sense of it. A car accident on a quiet street, just like that, she was gone. And I was left stumbling through life, trying to figure out how to exist without her. This trip was my last attempt at finding something, anything that made sense. So here I was, parked deep in the middle of nowhere, hoping that the forest would somehow offer answers. I didn't know what else to do. The trees stretched up into the sky, their thick trunks casting shadows that lingered even in the daylight. It was beautiful in a way, but it felt empty without her. I could almost hear her voice telling me to look at the wildflowers or marvel at the way the sunlight filtered through the branches. I stepped out of the RV. The cool, damp air wrapped around me. The scent of pine and moss was thick, earthy. Everything seemed so alive, and yet all I could feel was the weight of the past pressing down on me. I started a small fire, just like I'd done the past few nights, and sat there, watching the flames dance. The crackling wood was the only sound in the stillness. That's when I heard it, footsteps. They were faint, barely audible over the fire, but distinct enough to make me stand up, heart pounding in my chest. I looked around, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing, just shadows. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe some other animal, but the feeling stuck, the sense that someone was watching me. I wasn't alone. I sat back down, trying to shake the unease, but it lingered. I couldn't stop thinking about the old man I'd met the day before. Edgar. He'd been wandering the campground when I arrived, his wrinkled face covered in a scruffy beard, eyes sharp despite his age. He was friendly enough, but there had been something off about him. "You came at the wrong time," he'd said, staring at me with a knowing look. "Why is that?" I'd asked, brushing it off. "Some things shouldn't be disturbed, especially at night. The forest, it has its secrets." I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't respond. But his words stuck with me, replaying in my mind as I sat by the fire. What did he mean by secrets? What was he talking about? I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, sitting in the dark, with the fire flickering low, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to what he'd said. The wind picked up, making the trees sway, their branches creaking overhead. The fire sputtered as the breeze caught it, and I stood up again, feeling restless. I needed to move, to walk, anything to clear my head. I grabbed my flashlight and headed into the forest, just far enough to feel like I was doing something. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trunks of the trees, but casting long shadows everywhere else. My footsteps were the only sound now, crunching softly on the forest floor. I don't know how far I walked before I saw the first symbol. It was carved into the bark of a tree, a spiral-like shape that looked old, weathered by time. I crouched down, running my fingers over it. It was smooth, unnaturally so, like it had been carved recently. I stood up, shining the light around, and spotted more symbols carved into the trees at odd intervals. Spirals, faces, shapes that made no sense. They all seemed to be pointing deeper into the forest, like a trail leading me somewhere. A chill ran down my spine. I turned back, trying to ignore the nagging curiosity that pulled at me. I wasn't here to chase after strange carvings. I was here to, well, I didn't know why I was here anymore, but this wasn't it. As I made my way back toward the RV, the air seemed heavier, colder. I couldn't hear the wind anymore, and the shadows seemed darker. The feeling that I was being watched returned, stronger this time, like someone or something was following me. My pulse quickened, and I picked up the pace, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. Nothing, just trees and shadows. When I reached the RV, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The fire had gone out, leaving nothing but smoldering embers. I climbed inside, locked the door behind me, and sat on the edge of the bed, heart still racing. I was just tired. That's all it was. The grief, the isolation, it was messing with my head. I hadn't been sleeping well, and the loneliness had a way of playing tricks on the mind. At least that's what I told myself. The next morning, I met Leah. She was hiking near the campground, a pack slung over her shoulders, looking every bit the confident outdoors woman. She was friendly, outgoing, and struck up a conversation with me as soon as we crossed paths. "You camping out here alone?" she asked, her voice light, casual. I nodded. "Yeah, needed some time away, I guess." "I get that," she said, smiling. "This place is something else. It's beautiful, but it can get a little weird at night, don't you think?" I paused, remembering the footsteps, the carvings, Edgar's warnings. "Weird?" I asked. "How strange it can feel out here after dark. Just stories, old legends. You know how it is with places like this. Every forest has its ghost stories." I tried to keep my tone neutral, but the unease from the night before still lingered. She smiled again, but this time there was something in her eyes, like she knew more than she was letting on. "Just be careful. It's easy to get lost out here," she said. With that, she waved and continued down the trail, disappearing into the trees. I watched her go, wondering if I should have said more, asked her what she meant, but I didn't. I spent the rest of the day at camp, trying to relax, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. That night, as I sat by the fire again, I couldn't stop thinking about the symbols. They'd seemed so deliberate, so purposeful, like someone or something was trying to lead me deeper into the woods. And then the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, closer. I stood up, shining my flashlight toward the trees, but saw nothing, just shadows. But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled the RV, slow, deliberate, crunching on the forest floor. My throat tightened as I strained to listen, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who's there?" I called out, but the footsteps didn't answer. Instead, they stopped. Dead silence. I backed toward the RV, fumbling for the door when I saw it. Movement just at the edge of the trees. A figure, tall, thin, but barely visible in the darkness. I blinked and it was gone. I bolted inside, slamming the door behind me, my breath coming in short gasps. The next morning, Leah was gone. Her tent was still there, her pack sitting neatly outside, but she was nowhere to be found. I searched the area, calling her name, but the forest was silent. I left Fort Pino the next morning, the RV's engine sputtering to life as I drove away. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The forest had its secrets. I wasn't meant to know them. I thought the desert would heal me. Red Rock Canyon was supposed to be a place to clear my head, to sit in silence and let the vast, empty land take away the chaos of the last few months. I'd lost everything, my wife, my job, and I needed something, anything, to remind me there was still some peace left in the world. Instead, it felt like I'd driven into a nightmare. I parked the RV at the far end of the campground, as far away from the few other campers as I could get. I wanted solitude, to think, or maybe to stop thinking. I wasn't sure. The sun was setting as I stepped out, casting a deep orange glow across the red sandstone cliffs. It was beautiful. The kind of beauty that made you feel small, like the world was too big for you to matter. Maybe that's what I needed. I'd been driving for hours with only the occasional crackle of the radio for company. The RV was old, creaking and groaning as I navigated the winding roads into the canyon. It had seen better days, much like me. As I stretched, a low rumble came from under the hood. "Great," I muttered, giving the RV a half-hearted kick. The engine had been acting up for days, but I figured I could deal with it later. I wasn't here for that. I was here to get away, to let the emptiness of the desert swallow me whole. That night, after I'd settled in, I sat outside the RV, staring up at the stars. Out here, away from the city, the sky was incredible, clear, endless. But as the stars twinkled overhead, I noticed something strange. At first I thought they were planes, blinking in and out far above the canyon. But then they moved too fast, too erratically. I leaned forward, squinting. There were 3 of them, glowing faintly blue, darting through the sky in impossible patterns. They weren't planes. I wasn't sure what they were. I stood up, straining my neck to follow their path as they circled overhead. They blinked off one by one, and the desert was silent again. Just stars, I told myself, even though I knew it wasn't true. The next morning, I woke up to find the RV's battery almost dead. My phone, which I'd left charging overnight, hadn't gained a single bar. I tried turning the engine over, but all I got was a dull click. My chest tightened. Being stranded in the middle of the desert wasn't part of the plan. I had enough food and water for a few days, sure, but the isolation was starting to feel less like a retreat and more like a trap. Milo's RV was parked a few spots down, his beat-up rig sitting in the shade of a large rock formation. He waved me over as I stepped out of mine, a wide grin on his sunburnt face. "Morning," he called. "Beautiful day, huh?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, sure. Hey, you wouldn't happen to have jumper cables, would you?" Milo scratched his scruffy chin, then shook his head. "Sorry, friend, but I can give you a ride into town later if you need help. It's not too far." I thanked him, but something about Milo unsettled me. Maybe it was how relaxed he seemed, like this place wasn't bothering him at all. As I stood there, he tilted his head toward the canyon walls. "You see the lights last night?" he asked. I froze. "Yeah, what were they?" He shrugged, like it was nothing. "Oh, those things. People talk about them all the time. Could be military, could be something else. No one really knows, but they've been around as long as I've been camping out here." I laughed nervously. "Something else, huh?" Milo smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "People say they're not from this world. I don't know about that, but sometimes they follow you. Just don't go too far out at night and you'll be fine." I forced another laugh, but my stomach churned. Milo's tone was too casual, too accepting. I thanked him again and went back to my RV, trying to shake off the feeling that I was missing something important. The day dragged on, the heat baking the ground beneath my feet. I spent the afternoon hiking a short trail near the campground, trying to clear my head, but the vast emptiness only made me feel more alone. I kept thinking about the lights, about how they'd moved, how they seemed to watch me. That night, they returned. I was sitting outside again, nursing a warm beer and staring at the sky when I saw them. 3 faint blue lights hovering over the canyon. This time, they were closer, too close. They flickered almost playfully, darting back and forth like they were searching for something. I stood up, my heart pounding. It didn't make sense. Nothing about this place made sense. I backed toward the RV, never taking my eyes off the lights, but as I reached for the door, the lights blinked out. Gone, just like that. A cold breeze swept through the canyon, and I shivered. It was too quiet. No wind, no insects, nothing, just the dead, suffocating silence of the desert. Then the RV lights flickered once, twice, and went dark. My chest tightened as I stumbled into the RV, fumbling for the flashlight. I clicked it on, but the beam was weak, barely cutting through the darkness. The electrical panel was dead, and my phone wouldn't turn on. Every piece of technology I had was failing, and I had no idea why. A sudden knock on the door made me jump. "Chris, you okay?" It was Emily, the hiker I'd met earlier that day. She'd pitched her tent nearby, planning to stay for a few nights before heading out. I opened the door, trying to hide my panic. "Yeah, just some electrical issues," I said, forcing a smile. "Everything's dead. I'm guessing the battery's shot." Emily frowned, glancing back at her tent. That's weird. My phone's dead too, and my flashlight keeps flickering. Her voice was calm, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She felt it too, the strangeness in the air, the weight of the silence. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. Do you think it's the lights? Milo told me about them earlier, said people disappear sometimes. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my breathing steady. Disappear? Emily nodded, her gaze drifting toward the canyon. Yeah, it's mostly stories, but you seemed pretty convinced. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air felt thick, heavy, like the desert was closing in on us. I wasn't sure if I believed in Milo's campfire tales, but the lights, they were real, and they weren't natural. We should get out of here, Emily said, breaking the silence. I don't like this. I can't, I replied. My RV won't start. She hesitated, then nodded. Mine either. I tried earlier, but it's completely dead. We stood there, staring at each other, the weight of the situation sinking in. Something was wrong with this place. The lights weren't just an oddity. They were doing something, affecting everything around us, and we were stuck miles from any help. "6 months in the Smokies. 6 months. 6 whole months without touching a drop. I should have been proud, right? But sitting alone in this RV deep in the Great Smoky Mountains, I didn't feel proud. I felt restless, empty, even the kind of empty that creeps up on you, settling in your bones when there's nothing but the sound of your own thoughts bouncing around your skull. This trip was supposed to be a celebration, a gift to myself for staying clean. I thought the solitude would help me clear my head, maybe give me some perspective. The Smokies had always been a place of peace for me. My dad used to take me camping here when I was a kid, back when life was simple, before the bottle got its hooks into me. I pulled out my phone, flicking through pictures of those old trips. My thumb hesitated over the last photo of my dad and me standing by a roaring campfire. That was before everything went to hell, before the drinking became my escape from everything I couldn't face. The phone buzzed, pulling me back to the present. It was my brother Jake, checking in as usual. Hey man, he said when I answered. How's the trip? You hanging in there? Jake was always the responsible one, clean-cut, married with kids, a steady job. He'd been my lifeline after the wreckage of my addiction. I owed him more than I could ever repay. Yeah, it's good, I lied. Just me and the trees, peaceful. You staying out of trouble? I chuckled. I'm not exactly near any temptations out here, I said. I didn't tell him about the bottle I brought with me. It sat in the back of the RV, unopened but still there, just in case. A cruel comfort. I'd stared at it more than once already, the amber liquid calling to me in the quiet. Good to hear, Jake said, though I could hear the doubt in his voice. Just keep your head straight, all right? I know it's tough being out there alone, but you got this. Call me if you need anything. I will. Thanks. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the bed. The sun was setting outside, casting long shadows through the trees. The sky faded from a soft orange to deep purple, and with it, the familiar sense of isolation began to settle in. The first night in the Smokies should have been serene, but as soon as the darkness took over, I felt it, the unease. The forest around me was too quiet. It was like it was holding its breath. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the faint crackle of my campfire outside. I sat at the picnic table near the fire, trying to relax, but the silence only seemed to grow heavier. I poked at the flames with a stick, hoping they'd somehow keep the stillness at bay. Then I heard it, a whistle, faint at first, like a breeze cutting through the trees, but unmistakably human. I froze, listening. It was tuneless, just a single drawn-out note that seemed to float through the air. I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing. No movement. No one else was supposed to be this far out. I'd parked in a secluded area of the park, away from the main trails. The whistling continued, soft but constant. Probably just the wind, I muttered to myself. But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't true. It didn't sound like wind. It sounded deliberate. I stood, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling, and slowly circled the fire. I kept the flames between me and the trees, my eyes darting between the dark shapes of the pines. The whistle came again, louder this time, closer. My heart hammered in my chest, the familiar anxiety clawing its way up my throat. Who's there? I called, my voice breaking the thick silence. No response. Just another long, drawn-out whistle. I grabbed my flashlight from the RV and swept the beam through the trees. The light cut through the darkness, but all I saw were shadows. No footsteps, no crunch of leaves, just that damn whistling drifting through the trees like a ghost. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. It had to be nothing, right? Just a trick of the wind. The mountains could be strange like that, especially at night. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The bottle of whiskey in the back of the RV started to look more and more appealing, but I shoved that thought down. I wasn't here for that. Not this time. To clear my head, I went for a hike, following a trail that wound through the dense forest. The air was crisp, the smell of pine and damp earth filling my lungs. For a while, it worked. I could almost forget about the night before. Almost. That's when I saw the first marking. It was carved into the bark of a tree, a rough, jagged symbol that looked like a spiral or maybe an eye. I couldn't tell. It didn't look natural, though. It felt intentional, like a warning. I ran my fingers over it, the grooves deep and uneven. I kept walking, but the further I went, the more of the symbols I saw. Spirals, faces, strange runes carved into the trees, all leading deeper into the woods. It felt like they were guiding me somewhere, though I wasn't sure I wanted to find out where. That night, the whistling returned. I was sitting by the fire again, trying to keep my mind off the bottle when the sound came drifting through the trees. This time, it wasn't soft. It was louder, closer. I stood up, flashlight in hand, and scanned the forest. My heart pounded in my ears. My mouth went dry. The whistling seemed to circle the campsite, moving slowly but deliberately. It was all I could hear, filling the silence like a haunting lullaby. I turned, and that's when I saw him. Standing just beyond the tree line was a figure. A man gaunt and pale, his hollow eyes fixed on me. He stood motionless, his lips pursed as he whistled that same eerie, tuneless note. "Hey!" I called, my voice cracking. "What do you want?" The figure didn't respond. He just stood there, watching me. The whistling grew louder, more insistent, cutting through the night air like a knife. I took a step toward him, but as soon as I moved, he turned and disappeared into the trees. My hands were shaking. I wasn't sure if it was fear or something else, something deeper. I felt the urge to chase him, to follow that haunting sound, but my legs refused to move. I stayed by the fire until dawn, too scared to go back inside the RV. The next day, I tried to leave. I packed up my gear, grabbed the keys to the RV, and decided I'd had enough of the Smokies. But when I tried to start the engine, it wouldn't turn over, just a dull click. I swore under my breath, popped the hood, and checked the battery. Everything looked fine, but the damn thing wouldn't start. I tried calling Jake, but my phone was dead. I charged it the night before, but now it was completely drained. No signal, no service, nothing. The forest around me felt suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting just beyond the trees. The whistling started again, faint at first, then growing louder like a taunting melody. I grabbed the bottle from the back of the RV. I wasn't going to drink it, not yet. But holding it made me feel better, more in control, as if I could use it as a weapon somehow. That night, the stranger came back. I woke up to the sound of whistling, loud, sharp, right outside the RV. I sat up, heart pounding, and looked out the window. He was standing by the fire pit, his pale face illuminated by the flames. His eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, and that awful whistling filled the air, pressing in on me from all sides. He took a step toward the RV, and I felt the panic rise in my chest. I grabbed the bottle, holding it like a club, and stumbled outside. The air was freezing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whistling pierced through my skull, making it hard to think. I raised the bottle, ready to throw it, but then something stopped me. For the first time in days, I heard something else. A voice, faint but real. Jake's voice. "Nick, don't do it." I blinked, shaking my head. The stranger was gone. The whistling had stopped, and there in the silence, I realized what I had been about to do. The bottle slipped from my hands and shattered on the ground. I dropped to my knees, gasping for air, the weight of everything crashing down on me. The whistling was gone, but the fear, the isolation, it wasn't something I could run from. Not out here. Not anywhere. When the sun rose, I tried the RV again. This time it started. I drove out of the Smokies that morning, not looking back. The whistling stayed behind, lost in the trees, but the memory of it, the temptation, would stay with me. 6 months sober. But this trip taught me something I hadn't been ready to face. Some demons don't live in bottles. They live in the silence, in the spaces we create for ourselves when we're trying to hide from the world. The forest around me was too quiet. I'd been sitting by the campfire outside my RV, immersed in the silence for hours, but now something felt off. The kind of off you feel in your gut before your brain catches up to what's happening. No wind, no rustling in the leaves, just dead stillness. That was the first thing I noticed when I pulled up to this remote campsite deep in Mount Hood National Forest. A place like this should have been full of life, birds, insects, something, but the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant hum of the radio I'd brought along. I needed quiet after everything that had happened over the past year. I wasn't looking for distractions, just isolation. After my wife's death, nothing made sense anymore. People kept telling me I needed to move on, but the noise of life, the sympathy, the well-meaning advice, the friends who didn't know what to say, became unbearable. So I packed up and hit the road, hoping the wilderness would give me space to think, or maybe stop thinking altogether. I thought the forest would help. It had, until now. The radio's static broke the silence, a sudden burst of garbled noise that made me jump. I turned my head toward the RV, where the old ham radio sat inside. I hadn't even touched the thing in hours. It was an antique I'd brought along to mess around with in my downtime, but the signal had been dead all day. No stations, no chatter, nothing. Until now. I stood up from the fire, walked over to the RV, and ducked inside to check the radio. The static was louder, more insistent, like it was trying to form words, but couldn't quite get there. I twisted the dials, searching for a clearer signal, but all I got was more white noise. Then, through the crackling, I heard it. A voice, faint and garbled, speaking numbers, 1, 3, 7, 8, 9. The numbers repeated over and over, mechanical and cold, like a voice from an old number station. It didn't make sense. I was miles from anywhere, and this was supposed to be a dead zone. No signal, no interference. The voice paused for a moment, then the numbers started again. 1, 3, 7. It sent a chill through me, but I told myself it was just some rogue signal bouncing off the atmosphere, maybe a military transmission. There were logical explanations for this kind of thing. I was sure of it. But the way the numbers repeated over and over felt wrong. Like the message wasn't for just anyone, it was for me. I shut the radio off. My fingers were trembling slightly. I wasn't here for this. I needed quiet, not some weird radio signal rattling around in my head. The next day, I tried to forget about the radio. I spent the morning hiking through the woods. The towering pines loomed overhead like silent giants. The air was cool and damp, the sky just a sliver of gray through the dense canopy. But something gnawed at me, a faint buzzing at the back of my mind. No birds, no animals, just silence. When I returned to the campsite, the radio was on again, static blaring from the speakers. I hadn't touched it. I stepped inside the RV, staring at the radio like it might come to life. The static was louder now, more intense. I could feel it in my bones, like the vibration from a low hum in the ground. And beneath the static, the numbers were back. 1, 3, 7, 8. I slammed my hand down on the off switch, killing the sound. My pulse was racing, my mind scrambling for an explanation. It had to be a glitch, something with the wiring, maybe a stray electrical signal. I'd worked with enough technology over the years to know that things sometimes did strange things when you weren't looking. But the numbers, the way they were so clear, so deliberate, I shook it off and stepped back outside, trying to push the growing unease away. That's when I noticed the man standing at the edge of my campsite. I hadn't heard him approach. He was just there, tall, scruffy, wearing a weather jacket and a backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked like a camper, but there was something about the way he stood, stiff and tense, like he was waiting for something to happen. "Hey!" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "You lost?" The man looked at me, his face tight with anxiety. "I heard it too," he said. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "Heard what?" "The signal, the numbers," he said, glancing toward the RV. "I've been picking it up on my own radio. It's not normal." My mouth went dry. You've heard it too? The man nodded. I'm Ben, he said, stepping closer, his voice low. I was camping a few miles down the road. I've been getting static, voices, weird electrical interference. My GPS stopped working. My cell phone drained to 0 in minutes. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. What do you think it is? Ben shook his head, his eyes darting toward the trees. I don't know, but it's not natural. The way the signal moves, it's like it's getting closer. I didn't know how to respond to that. I was a man of logic, of science. Signals were signals. Glitches were glitches. But there was something about the way Ben spoke, the fear in his eyes, that made my skin crawl. That night, the radio came to life again. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the campfire and the peaceful silence of the woods, but the static was louder than before. The numbers were clearer, more insistent. 1, 3, 7, 8. Ben was sitting across from me, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. His eyes constantly scanned the dark forest around us. He hadn't relaxed since he showed up, and I couldn't blame him. There was something wrong here, something I couldn't explain. You think it's some kind of broadcast? I asked, more to fill the silence than anything. Ben shook his head. I don't think it's a broadcast at all. What do you mean? He hesitated, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. I think it's a warning or a signal from something out there. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. A warning from what? Before I could ask, the static on the radio cut out for a moment. There was only silence, the kind of silence that presses down on you, that makes your skin prickle with anticipation. Then a sound, a soft rhythmic clicking, like something metallic tapping against wood. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees, but the beam only revealed darkness. The clicking grew louder, echoing through the forest. And then through the radio, a voice crackled to life. We see you. My blood ran cold. Ben's eyes widened, his face pale. What the hell was that? I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The voice repeated, distorted and mechanical. We see you. I stood up, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The clicking sound was closer now, coming from all around us, moving through the trees. The forest seemed to pulse with energy, the air growing thick and heavy, like the atmosphere itself was alive. I think we should leave, Ben said, his voice tight with fear. For once I agreed. The next morning I found Ben's tent abandoned. His gear was scattered around the clearing, but there was no sign of him, no footprints, no note. Just the cold, empty forest and the low hum of static that had settled into the air like a living thing. I tried to follow his tracks, but they vanished in the thick underbrush. It was like he'd walked into the trees and disappeared. The GPS on my phone was useless, spinning me in circles. The battery drained faster than I'd ever seen. The static in my ears grew louder the further I went, like the signal was inside my head vibrating through my skull. The numbers were back too, repeating over and over, etched into my mind. 1, 3, 7. By midday, I stumbled across something I hadn't expected. An old, dilapidated radio tower hidden deep in the woods. The metal was rusted, vines crawling up the sides, but it was still faintly humming with power. I climbed the tower, every step echoing in the stillness. My heart hammered in my chest. At the top, I found the source of the signal, a small glowing device pulsing with an eerie cold light. It didn't belong here. It wasn't part of the original tower. It was something else, something foreign. I reached out and touched it, and the static in my head exploded. The numbers, the clicking, the voices, it all crashed into me at once. An unbearable cacophony of sound. I stumbled back, nearly falling off the tower as the forest seemed to come alive around me. The lights returned, flickering in the trees, cold and mechanical. The clicking grew louder, more frantic, like something was chasing me. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to the RV, but the lights followed me, the clicking never far behind. But I managed to get inside and slam the door shut. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. The device still clutched in my hand. As I drove away, the static began to fade, but the numbers never left me. They echoed in my mind, a constant whisper, even as the forest disappeared in the rearview mirror. It's been days now, and I'm still hearing them. 1, 3, 7. I can't get them out of my head, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there, whatever sent that signal, knows where I am, and it's not done with me yet. I'd been driving for hours, the narrow desert highway stretching endlessly in front of me. The sun was a golden orb sinking behind the mesas, painting the sky in fiery hues. My RV rattled as the pavement turned to dirt, the road leading me deeper into the vast, silent expanse of Canyon Hollow. This was where I wanted to be, alone, surrounded by nothing but red rock and the occasional shriek of a hawk. I needed to clear my head, to find some kind of peace, or at least distraction. 6 months had passed since the accident, but the guilt was as raw as ever. I should have been more careful. I couldn't escape that thought, no matter how far I drove. Canyon Hollow was famous for its petroglyphs, remnants of an ancient people whose art told stories of life, death, and something in between. It was also infamous for its mysteries, tales of settlers who vanished, of travelers who never made it out. But I didn't believe in that sort of thing. History was history, nothing more. I pulled into the campground as dusk settled, parking near the edge of the canyon. There were only 2 other campers, an older couple in a beat-up RV several spots down. They waved as I stepped out, and I gave them a nod. The silence of the desert was almost unnerving, the kind of quiet that pressed on your ears. I shook it off and set up camp, promising myself a good night's rest before exploring the next day. That first night, I dreamed of the accident. I was back on the ridge, the rocks crumbling beneath my feet. I heard Alex shouting, his voice raw with panic. My hands reached out for him, but I wasn't fast enough. I woke up drenched in sweat, my chest tight. The silence outside was absolute, broken only by the occasional creak of the RV as it settled into the cool desert air. I stepped outside for some fresh air. The moon hung high, casting long shadows over the red rocks. I could see the older couple's RV, their lights off. Beyond them, the canyon stretched out, an ocean of darkness. That's when I heard it, a faint voice carried on the wind. Ethan. I froze, my heart pounding. The voice was faint but unmistakable. It was Alex's. Impossible, I told myself. Just a trick of the wind. I stood there for a moment, staring into the void before retreating to the safety of the RV. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease. The sun was bright, and the desert looked almost friendly in the daylight. I packed a bag with water and snacks and set off to explore the petroglyphs. The trail was rugged, winding through narrow canyons and open plains dotted with junipers. The carvings appeared in clusters, etched into the stone with astonishing precision. Animals, spirals, figures locked in what looked like dances or battles. Then I found the symbols. Unlike the other carvings, these were jagged and erratic, spirals that twisted into themselves like whirlpools. They didn't fit with the rest of the art. Standing there, I felt a chill despite the sun. It wasn't just the symbols, it was the silence. No birds, no wind, just me and the rocks. When I got back to camp, the older couple's RV was gone. At first, I thought that they'd left while I was out, but their spot was wrong. Their folding chairs were still there, along with a cooler and a half-empty coffee mug. Their fire pit had ashes that were still warm. I walked over, calling out, but no one answered. The RV keys were sitting on the folding table as if they'd just stepped away for a moment. A heavy unease settled over me, but I convinced myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe they'd gone for a hike. Maybe they'd gotten a ride into town. But as night fell, the unease turned into something closer to fear. The wind picked up after sundown, howling through the canyon like a living thing. I sat inside the RV, trying to focus on anything but the emptiness outside. That's when I noticed the journal. It was sitting on my passenger seat, leather-bound and worn. I hadn't seen it there before. My pulse quickened as I flipped it open. The handwriting was shaky but legible, the entries chronicling the travels of someone who had camped here before me. At first, the notes were mundane, descriptions of the canyon, complaints about the heat. But as the entries went on, they grew darker. Something is out there. I see shadows at night, faces in the mirrors. I thought I was alone, but I'm not. They're watching me. The last entry sent a chill down my spine. Don't let them in. No matter what you hear, don't let them in. I snapped the journal shut, my hands trembling. The RV groaned as the wind buffeted it, and for a moment I thought I heard a knock at the door. Just the wind, I told myself. But then it came again, louder. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking. No answer. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door. The desert stretched out before me, empty and silent. But then I saw them, footprints in the dirt, leading from the ridge down to my RV. My stomach turned. That night, I barricaded the door with everything I could find. Sleep was out of the question. The whispers started around midnight, faint at first, then louder. They called my name, voices I recognized but couldn't place. Alex was one of them. I covered my ears, rocking back and forth until the sun came up. The next day, I decided to leave. I packed up as fast as I could and started the engine, relief flooding me when it roared to life. But as I drove toward the exit, the road twisted and looped, always bringing me back to the campground. I tried every direction, but it was no use. It was like the canyon wouldn't let me go. Desperation drove me back to the petroglyphs. I followed the spirals, hoping they held some kind of answer. The silence was crushing now, the air heavy with dread. And then I saw it, a wagon train, fully intact, crossing the canyon in the distance. At first I thought it was a mirage, but as I got closer, the figures became clearer. Men, women, and children in 19th century clothing. Their faces were pale, their movements slow and deliberate. I shouted, waving my arms, but they didn't react. As I approached, they vanished, leaving only skeletal remains of wagons and rusted tools in their wake. That night, they came for me. I sat in the RV, knife in hand, as shadows moved outside. The voices were louder now, pleading and accusing all at once. "Why did you leave me, Ethan?" Alex's voice cut through the din, filled with anger and sorrow. The windows fogged as hollow faces pressed against the glass, their empty eye sockets weeping black tears. They began to bang on the walls, the door shaking on its hinges. "You can't hide," they whispered. "You belong here with us." I thought of the journal, of its warning not to let them in, but the voices grew louder, more insistent, filling my head with guilt and regret. I clutched the knife, my knuckles white. Then I remembered the spirals. The petroglyphs had to mean something, a way out, a key. I grabbed Alex's compass, the only keepsake I had of him, and bolted from the RV. The shadows followed, their whispers echoing through the canyon. I reached the spirals and fell to my knees, holding the compass above the carvings. "I'm sorry," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I'm so sorry, Alex." The air grew still. The shadows stopped moving. One by one they dissolved into the canyon mist, their voices fading into silence. The compass grew warm in my hand before falling still. The road was clear. The next morning, I didn't question it. I drove until the canyon was a distant memory, the horizon opening up before me. But even now, they're still watching, that someday, somewhere, the whispers will start again. Nobody tells you that being a small-town cop is just glorified babysitting. Not until you're knee-deep in chasing down some idiot for stealing lawn chairs off his neighbor's porch. My name's Jacob Spivey. I've been patrolling the streets of Silver Grove, Ohio for the better part of 10 years. Not a long time, but long enough to get a feel for the place, know everyone by their first name, and learn which drunk idiots you're going to have to drag out of the bar after a Browns game. It was 1997, a year that stuck with me for a lot of reasons, mostly because it was the year everything went sideways. Way sideways. Small towns have their secrets, sure, but nothing like this. So it all started when the calls came in about a group of kids gone missing. Typical small-town stuff, you'd think. Kids wandering off into the woods to do whatever it is kids do these days. Hell, I remember sneaking into the woods as a kid myself. But this was different. It wasn't just a couple of teenagers disappearing after a Saturday night. We were talking 4 kids, all under the age of 12. They were out for a camping trip with some Boy Scout group, and nobody had seen them since they wandered away from the campfire. Naturally, I got called in along with my partner, Jared Granger. Granger, bless his soul, was as reliable as a broken flashlight, but he had a good heart, even if it was buried under layers of bad jokes and self-doubt. We headed out to where the kids were last seen, right at the edge of Fox Hollow Woods, a stretch of thick forest that everyone in town avoided, mostly because of the rumors. You've heard of the creepy stories, right? Every town has them. Fox Hollow had its share. The old-timers used to talk about strange animals, twisted things that shouldn't exist, lurking deep in the woods. Kids would swear they saw shadows moving just outside their vision. Me? I figured it was just the usual nonsense. You hear something enough times and it loses its edge. We spent the better part of the morning trudging through the woods, calling out the kids' names, hoping they'd come running. Nothing. No sign of them, not even a footprint or a half-eaten sandwich. And then Granger, in his infinite wisdom, decided to crack a joke. Maybe they got snatched by Bigfoot Spivey, he said, chuckling to himself. I ignored him. Granger had a habit of cracking jokes when things got tense, but even he started to get quiet when we found the first clue, at least what we thought was a clue. About a mile in, we stumbled across an old beat-up tent. Looked like it had been there for years. Inside, we found a pile of old bones, picked clean. Not human, thank God, but something about it gave me the creeps. I radioed back to the station, told them we'd found a campsite, but no sign of the kids. The dispatcher's voice crackled back, telling us to keep searching, so we did. We went deeper into Fox Hollow than I ever had before. Granger was quiet by now, his usual jokes replaced with nervous glances over his shoulder. It was late afternoon when we found something I still can't explain. There was this clearing, completely silent, no birds, no wind, nothing. In the center of the clearing was a small mound, like someone had piled up dirt and left it there. It wasn't the mound that bothered me, though. It was what was on top of it. A pile of shoes, tiny shoes like the kind you'd see on kids. Some of them were old, dirty, covered in mud, while others looked practically new, like they'd just been worn yesterday. My stomach turned, and Granger looked like he was about to be sick. Maybe it's some kind of prank, Granger muttered, but I could tell he didn't believe it. We were standing there, trying to figure out what to do next, when we heard something, a rustling sound, like leaves being dragged across the ground. We both turned at the same time, and that's when we saw it. Or him, I guess. At first, I thought it was a man, just some vagrant who'd been living in the woods too long. He was hunched over, his back bent in a way that didn't seem natural. His arms were too long, his skin stretched thin, and his head, God, I don't even know how to describe it. It looked like he was wearing a mask, but it wasn't a mask. His face was twisted, contorted, like it had been melted and reshaped into something almost human, but not quite. He didn't move right either. It was like he was learning how to walk all over again. Jerky movements, his head twitching from side to side as he shuffled toward us. My hand went straight to my holster, but Granger was frozen. Couldn't blame him. I was terrified too. But cops don't get paid to be scared, so I yelled out, "Stop, police!" The thing didn't stop. It just kept coming, slow at first, but then it broke into a run, barreling toward us faster than anything that should be able to move on two legs. I pulled my gun, fired twice, dead center. It should have dropped, but it didn't, just kept coming. Granger finally snapped out of it, pulled his gun too, and we both unloaded on this thing, but it was like shooting at air. It didn't even flinch. I wish I could say we stood our ground, acted like the tough cops we were supposed to be, but I'd be lying. We ran like hell, crashing through the trees, barely able to keep our footing. That thing, it chased us. But it wasn't just following us, it was toying with us, cutting us off, herding us in one direction, deeper into the woods. We finally made it to a stream, and I dove into it, figuring that maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't follow us into the water. Granger was right behind me, gasping for air. I'll never forget the look on his face, the terror that had replaced his usual cocky grin. "Did you see it?" Granger whispered, his voice shaking. "What the hell was that?" I didn't answer. I didn't have an answer. We stayed there in the water for what felt like hours, waiting, listening. It was getting dark by the time we finally crawled out and made our way back to the road. By then, I was starting to think we'd imagined the whole thing, that maybe it was just some kind of mass hysteria. But then we found Granger's jacket. It was lying on the road, torn to shreds. There were no footprints, no signs of a struggle, just his jacket, lying there like a forgotten piece of litter. We reported it, of course, told the chief what we'd seen, but you can imagine how that went. Nobody believed us. Missing kids, sure, but a monster in the woods? Yeah, right? We were told to take a few days off, clear our heads, but I couldn't clear my head. Neither could Granger. He stopped coming to work after that, said he was moving, getting the hell out of Silver Grove. Can't say I blame him. I stuck around, though. Someone had to figure out what happened to those kids. A week later, the bodies were found. Well, what was left of them. They were scattered through the woods, mauled, torn apart like roadkill. But it wasn't animals. No animal could do that. I know what we saw that day wasn't human, but nobody else does. Nobody else will. The thing that lives in Fox Hollow Woods is still out there, and it's not done yet. I pulled my RV into the secluded campsite just as the rain started. The drops pinged against the roof like tiny bullets, creating a rhythm that, under other circumstances, might have been calming. But as I stepped out into the chill, I felt anything but calm. The Columbia River Gorge was supposed to be beautiful, a place where you could lose yourself in nature and leave the chaos of the world behind. That's what I told myself when I agreed to take this assignment, a photography spread on the rare owls that called the gorge home. It wasn't just work. It was a way to connect with the wilderness my dad had loved so much. He'd been gone 3 months now, and I hadn't yet figured out how to deal with the silence he left behind. The gorge felt like a fitting tribute, the kind of place he'd have taken me as a kid, pointing out tracks in the dirt and birds in the canopy. But as I stood there, staring at the dark forest ahead, I felt more alone than ever. The first day wasn't so bad. The rain let up by mid-morning, and I managed to find a good spot to set up my camera near one of the gorge's many waterfalls. The cascading water was mesmerizing, its roar drowning out the world. And for a while, I forgot about everything else. That was until I heard the whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the trees, but it had a rhythm to it, a cadence, words I couldn't make out, but that felt intentional. I scanned the area, half expecting to see someone nearby, but there was no one. Just your imagination, I muttered to myself, but the words didn't convince me. That night, as I reviewed the photos I'd taken, the rain came back with a vengeance. The RV rocked slightly in the wind, and the forest outside the windows turned into an impenetrable wall of black. I tried to focus on the images, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One shot in particular stood out, a photo of the waterfall. In the corner, faint but unmistakable, was a shadowy figure standing among the trees. I told myself it was a trick of the light, just the contrast of the water spray against the dark forest. But then I heard the footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and heavy. At first, they seemed far off, but they grew louder, closer, circling the RV. I turned off the light and peered out the window, but all I saw was the rain. The footsteps stopped, but the unease stayed with me long after I'd crawled into bed. The next day, I ventured deeper into the forest, determined to shake off the previous night's paranoia. The gorge was breathtaking, its trails winding through dense greenery and past cliffs that offered stunning views of the river below. I lost myself in the work, snapping shots of moss-covered rocks and misty trees. That's when I found the carvings. They were etched into a cluster of boulders, spiraling symbols that looked ancient. I ran my fingers over one, noting how smooth it felt, as if it had been worn down by centuries of wind and rain. At the center of the largest carving was a stone, perfectly round and black as night. It almost seemed to pulse when I touched it. I pocketed the stone without thinking. Something about it felt significant, though I couldn't explain why. The forest felt heavier on the way back to the RV, the air thick with humidity and something else I couldn't name. As I neared camp, I spotted a figure in the distance. My breath caught in my throat. It was a man, standing perfectly still, facing away from me. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing. The man didn't move. I took a step closer, but as I did, the figure dissolved into the shadows. My pulse quickened. I hurried back to the RV and locked the door behind me. That night the rain stopped, but the forest outside was anything but quiet. The whispers came back, louder this time, accompanied by faint laughter. And then I heard his voice. "Ethan." It was my dad, clear as day. "Dad?" I said aloud, my voice trembling. "Come here," the voice beckoned. It was coming from outside, pulling me toward the trees. I froze, my hand hovering over the door handle. A part of me knew it couldn't be real, knew that opening that door would be a mistake. But the voice was so familiar, so comforting. It took every ounce of willpower I had to stay inside. The next morning, I woke to find the RV surrounded by a circle of stones. They were identical to the one I'd pocketed, each one perfectly smooth and black. My stomach dropped. As I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me. The forest was silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness. And then I saw it. It stood on a rock, its form shrouded in shadow. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs too long, its posture too still. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in a dying fire. "Leave what you took," the figure said, its voice gravelly, deep, and laced with menace. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. What are you?" The figure tilted its head as if studying me. "Leave what you took," it repeated before fading into the trees. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I considered leaving, but the RV's battery was dead, and the nearest ranger station was miles away. I was trapped. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. The shadows outside the RV seemed to move, twisting and contorting into impossible shapes. I clutched the black stone in my hand, suddenly certain it was the key to everything. "Is this what you want?" I shouted, stepping outside and holding the stone aloft. The Sandman appeared again, its glowing eyes fixed on me. "Leave what you took," it said, its voice echoing through the gorge. I threw the stone into the forest, my chest heaving. The Sandman didn't move. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing toward the cliffs. "Come," it whispered. I didn't follow. Instead, I bolted back into the RV and slammed the door. The Sandman's form loomed outside, but it didn't approach. Instead, it simply stared, its eyes burning into me. Somehow, I managed to jumpstart the RV. The next morning, as I drove out of the gorge, the weight that had pressed on me for days began to lift. But the memory of the Sandman stayed with me, its whispers echoing in my mind. Weeks later, as I developed my photos, I found something chilling in one shot. A stunning image of an owl perched on a branch. There was a shadow in the background, tall, humanoid, with glowing eyes. I haven't returned to the gorge since, but sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I hear it again. Leave what you took. My name is Ellie Carter. I'm 29 years old, and I write for a travel magazine. This happened last October when I took my RV to Devil's River State Natural Area in Texas to research a piece for an article called Hidden Gems of Texas. I thought I was prepared for the isolation, the wilderness, and even the eerie stories about the place. I was wrong. What I experienced there still haunts me. I arrived late in the afternoon, my RV kicking up a cloud of dust as I drove along the unpaved road to the campground. Devil's River was stunning, crystal clear water winding through rocky terrain, flanked by sprawling desert vegetation. The remoteness was exactly what I was looking for. No cell service, no crowds, just nature in its purest form. After parking in a designated spot near the river, I stepped out to stretch and breathe in the crisp, dry air. That's when a sheriff's vehicle rolled up beside me. The man inside, a stocky, middle-aged man in a tan uniform, stepped out and tipped his hat. "You must be the writer," he said, his voice steady but friendly. "I'm Sheriff Hank Moreno. Just wanted to check in, make sure you're set up okay." "Thanks," I said, brushing dust off my jeans. "Just got here. It's beautiful." "It is," he replied, his expression softening. "But it's also dangerous if you're not careful. This place gets real dark at night, and the river is deeper than it looks. Stick to the trails and don't wander too far after sundown." "I'll keep that in mind," I said, forcing a smile. "Good," he said, tipping his hat again before climbing back into his vehicle. "Welcome to Devil's River." As I set up my RV, I noticed another camper about 100 yards away. She had a small tent pitched by the river and a collection of gear that suggested she was staying longer than me. She waved as I passed, and I decided to introduce myself. "Hey, I'm Ellie," I said. "Here for the weekend." The woman smiled, brushing her curly hair out of her face. "Becky Turner. I'm here for as long as it takes. As long as what takes? The devil's light, she said, her voice brimming with excitement. You've heard of it, right? I shrugged. Something about a glowing light? Sheriff didn't mention it. Becky nodded, her smile widening. It's an old legend. People say it's a spirit that lures travelers into the wilderness. Some call it a will-o'-the-wisp. Others say it's the devil himself. I'm here to find out. I tried not to laugh. So you're a ghost hunter? Amateur paranormal investigator, she corrected, and Devil's River is one of the most active spots in Texas. I nodded politely, but her enthusiasm bordered on absurd. Still, she seemed harmless enough. That night, I set up my camera to capture the stars. The sky here was unlike anything I'd seen before, a vast canvas of shimmering light. Around midnight, as I adjusted the exposure, something caught my eye. A faint, flickering light danced across the river. At first, I thought it was another camper's lantern, but it moved too smoothly, too deliberately. I grabbed my zoom lens and focused on the light. It appeared to hover above the water, shifting between white, yellow, and a strange bluish-green hue. Ellie! Becky's voice called out behind me, startling me. I turned to see her jogging toward me, flashlight in hand. Did you see it? She asked breathlessly. The light? I asked. Yeah, what is it? Becky's grin widened. It's the devil's light. We have to follow it. I frowned. Follow it? Isn't that the whole thing? People who follow it disappear. That's the legend, she said. But I'm here to figure out what's really going on. It's probably just gas or reflections, but imagine if it's something more. I hesitated, then shook my head. I'm staying here. Good luck. Becky looked disappointed, but nodded. Suit yourself. She headed toward the river, her flashlight bouncing with each step. I watched her disappear into the darkness, my unease growing. The next morning, I ran into Sheriff Moreno while hiking to a scenic overlook. He seemed relieved to see me still in one piece. I see, he said. Of course, I replied, though my tone lacked conviction. Do you know anything about the devil's light? His face darkened. It's just a story. But I've had to search for enough people who went missing out here to know there's something off about this place. Stay close to camp, Ellie. Don't go chasing things you don't understand. I wanted to argue, to insist that I didn't believe in ghosts or curses, but something about his tone stopped me. I nodded and promised to be careful. That evening, I sat by the river, scribbling notes for my article. The light returned, brighter and closer this time. It moved along the water's surface, then stopped, hovering just above the far bank. Becky? I called, but there was no answer. I grabbed my flashlight and walked to her campsite, only to find it abandoned. Her tent was still there, along with her equipment, but Becky was gone. Panic rose in my chest. Becky! I shouted into the night, my voice echoing across the canyon. The light flickered, and for a moment I thought I heard her voice. Ellie, help me. Without thinking, I stepped into the river, the cold water soaking my boots as I waded toward the sound. The further I walked, the brighter the light became, until it enveloped me entirely. I stopped, shielding my eyes, and realized I wasn't alone. Figures emerged within the light. Shadows of people, their faces hollow and spectral. They reached out to me, their hands translucent and trembling. Help us, they whispered in unison, their voices layered with desperation. I turned to run, but the water dragged at my legs, holding me in place. One of the figures stepped forward, a woman with long, wet hair clinging to her face. It was Becky. Ellie, please, she said, her voice cracking. Don't leave me. Becky, I whispered, my throat dry, her face twisted, her eyes darkening. Stay with us, she said, her voice overlapping with the others. Forever. Fear surged through me, and I fought against the water's grip. The light pulsed, growing brighter and hotter, as if it were alive. No! I screamed, pulling myself free and stumbling back toward the shore. The whispers grew louder, turning into wails that echoed in my skull. When I reached the riverbank, the light disappeared, plunging the area into silence. I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air, my heart pounding. The next morning, Sheriff Moreno found me packing up my RV. I told him Becky was missing, and he nodded grimly. Another one, he muttered under his breath. I debated telling him about the light, about the voices, but I knew he wouldn't believe me. Instead, I handed him Becky's journal, which I'd found near her tent. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw the light flicker behind me. I haven't written about Devil's River. Some stories aren't meant to be shared, but sometimes, late at night, I dream about the light and the whispers return. And I wonder if Becky's still out there, waiting for someone else to answer her call.